Great, thank you, Scott, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Yes, when Scott called me one day saying, can you just free associate, riff on this idea of migration, identity, and belonging as it relates to cooperatives, what comes to mind? Several of the different stories I'll tell tonight really just came straight from that phone call, things that were off the top of my head. How do I think these themes relate to Minnesota's co-ops? So you're going to hear probably some stories you've never heard before about the cooperative movement, and there are a lot of stories I won't be able to tell, and I will give synopses of some of these that you might disagree with. Maybe you know of a co-op I'm going to refer to, and you'll take issue with how I describe its origin story, and I apologize for that, but I'm just going to give my version of events. So the first thing I want to do is give you a loose definition of how I'm going to talk about cooperatives and mutuals. So the reason I use the word mutual, first of all, is because when we go back and look when these businesses were first formalizing and becoming named as something distinct, the term mutual came up a lot, and we still see this carry over in the form of mutual insurance. Mutual insurance is using all of the same principles as the cooperative model. It's just the origins were so long back that we call it mutual insurance now. Similarly, credit unions are cooperatives, but in their origin story, the term was about the union, the credit union. And so that term is what carries over instead of the cooperative term. So I'm going to try to encompass all of these things in the ways I talk about cooperation and mutuality. And this slideshow will be available after the presentation. And there's a little note at the bottom here. If you really want a technical definition, a very specific definition, you can go to the website that's listed there. But the way I'm going to think about it today is it's people coming together to operate an enterprise to meet their shared economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. Now that could be just about anything. And it ends up that cooperatives do just about anything you can imagine. They're not very constrained. There are a few principles that you see play out. First one here is that everyone's voice has equal value in some form. And so you see this in cooperatives having one member, one vote. When you're voting on an issue for the organization or the board of directors, democracy's baked in. And that's based on this concept that everybody involved in the enterprise has value. Their voice is important. There'll be forums, there'll be meetings and spaces. You can't change the charter, the organizational core of the document without getting agreement from the members. That's a manifestation of that first point. The second, that participation, that actually being involved in using the business and interacting with that enterprise is just as equal as putting the money in to make sure it gets capitalized in the first place. And we'll talk about this a little more in a second. Co-ops are independent from government and other special interests. So they're not beholden to a particular group, even a small group of investors. They're their own member-oriented beast. So because they're independent, they will be at odds with governments sometimes. They will be at odds with special interests from within their own membership. But they're autonomous from all of that. And they themselves as a business model are the product of self-help. People coming together to help themselves, again, to meet these needs and aspirations. But often we see cooperatives expressing solidarity with other co-ops, with community organizations, with people and organizations that they seem to have some shared interest with. I'm going to kind of position this enterprise model as being somewhere between and sharing aspects of two paradigms that people in today's context are familiar with, the nonprofit idea and the for-profit. Cooperatives are neither of these things. There's something in between that shares a little bit of what's going on in each of those worlds. So a co-op can take investment, unlike a nonprofit, which cannot. A co-op I'll go back to this participation concept, that participation is just as important as investment. When you distribute profit in an investor-owned firm, you distribute that profit based on how much investment you put in. In a co-op, you end up distributing profit based on how much you actually were there using the business that year. So we don't even use the term profit. We say patronage with the root participation. So when you get your profit sharing check from, let's say, REI or your food co-op or some other co-op that you're part of, it might even show up in your credit union, your mutual insurance account statement. That's based on how much you participated in doing business, not your investment, not your stock. And that's pretty different from the investor-oriented model, and you don't get anything like it in the nonprofit model. And again, you have this democratic control by members, which you're not going to see in the other forms. In an investor-oriented firm, you're generally going to see voice is equivalent to the dollars invested, and in a nonprofit, it's kind of up to the legacy of whoever formed the thing, how the governance is determined. I want to give a brief overview globally. The cooperatives really do exist in every single business sector, and I mentioned a few already. They electrify 85% of this country's landmass, so they're in the energy sector. They're in financial services, which we talked about. We're all going to be probably familiar with food co-ops, but they're in a lot of other aspects of our daily life. There's over 1 billion members in 145 countries. If you just look at the top 300 co-ops, their combined revenues is equivalent to the 9th largest country in the world. So this is, if you combined the 300 firms, you would have an economic activity like Russia or Spain. Significant. Now they don't coordinate that closely, so they're not nearly as effective at negotiating as a group as, say, an individual nation, but you can see what it would be if you aggregated this. International bodies such as the United Nations really recognize that cooperatives build a better world. These images on the lower left are from the International Year of Cooperatives in 2012, where cooperatives were elevated and celebrated throughout the world. You can see all these different languages. UNESCO on the right there, this year, recognized cooperatives as being an intangible cultural asset to the world. And this is something that crosses a lot of cultures. And so when you think about belonging and identity, people's origin stories of where cooperatives come from, where the spirit of coming together and treating each other as equals to meet our needs, is not something that originated in England or Sweden or elsewhere. It's actually in everybody's origin story one way or another. There are a lot of different terms that get used to describe it. I just want to do a quick kind of nickel tour through the Nordic countries. In Finland, 75–80% of the population is a member of a co-op. On average, people are members of 2 co-ops. If you're a farmer in Finland, on average, you're a member of 4 co-ops. It's 17% of the GDP when you combine the 5,000 co-op firms in Finland. The UN commissioned this study to create a cooperative economy index. They kind of tried to find the top 10 countries that have cooperatives in them, and they used the criteria that I outlined in the Sweden example here. Sweden didn't make it to the top 10. It's within the top 20 is my estimate, but they didn't put a number to it. So number of memberships, Sweden has 13 million memberships in a country of about 10 million people. Combined revenue of, in US dollars, 45 billion, and they employ 80,000 in Sweden. Denmark and Norway are 9th and 10th in the Global Cooperative Economy Index, and Finland ranks 4th. Iceland has none, or nearly none, and their cooperative law was changed at a time when they were considered the #1 most cooperative country in the world. And if you talk to historians about Iceland today, they would say it was basically stolen in a moment with Parliament where the law was changed and everything was kind of moved over to an investor-owned firm. And there's an effort now within the Parliament to introduce a new law so that they can start using cooperatives again. The law's on the books, it's no good though. So that's a current discussion. So here's a map of the US. There's about 30,000 co-ops in the US. They're in many different sectors. Together, their revenues are around $500 billion a year, and the wages they pay are around $80 billion a year, and that's about the same as how much profit sharing is going to the members. So you've got about 80 billion in wages going out, and you've got about 80 billion in profit sharing to the members who participate in that business. Just want to focus in on Minnesota just for a second, because I'm going to talk a bit about activity in the Iron Range. And if you know where the Iron Range is, the laser works here, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of co-ops there. And this is because the co-ops often work together to accomplish their ends. And so a single dot here represents the headquarters of a co-op, but it doesn't mean it's every single location. So you're going to have a lot more co-op locations than show up on this map. This was commissioned by the US Department of Agriculture a few years back. This is one of the early co-ops up on the Iron Range that I was able to find a good picture of. It's kind of a promotional picture of this Finnish co-op that showing off some of the branded products. And on the right, we have the coffee can, that's before 1933 when they changed the logo. And if you look in that side of that star, you'll see the hammer and sickle. And in 1933, there was this clash between the Communist Party, which had been informally and sometimes formally supporting the co-ops, and the members of the co-ops, which have been just running them as their own enterprise for a while. Well, in the lead up to the convention in 1933, there was this clash, and the Communist Party said, you need to start making payments to us, you need to help us finance our operations because we're getting hurt over here in Europe. And the members said, no, there's no way we're going to do that. And it turned into this major issue in terms of the Communist Party attacking individuals who resisted this notion and trying to form factions, trying to bring people to the meetings in order to vote in favor of supporting the party. If we think about this independent principle, it just isn't meant to be. It's not a political beast. And so although co-ops will support a particular political issue from time to time, often they're not partisan. And here we saw that the co-ops did not go the way of the communists. And in 1934, they dropped the hammer and sickle because they've decided that they're not going to be affiliated anymore. Go back one more. So that co-op, I had a picture of the Alanto co-op, that formed during times of mining strikes up on the range. And really, the strike in 1916 and 1917 really coalesced many groups around the Iron Range to form a federation of co-ops. And so that's what this picture on the left is the Central Exchange, where all these different groups that were there to support the miners and the mining families that either had been locked out of being able to purchase from other stores because they were known to be striking, or they didn't have the funds and they needed some mechanism to be in solidarity, and so they created co-ops informally to lower their costs and deliver basic goods and services. You see co-ops of this occasional nature form during disasters as well. And so disaster response around the world, even today, will often flow through co-ops because there are these embedded organizations in the community. If you deliver your water and your medical supplies and so on to a co-op, people immediately have these networks that form. Well, strikes everywhere in the world, when they would form back in this day, there would be a co-op that would pair with the strike. It would be basic things like groceries and taking care of people and making sure that the people can get to the picket lines if they need to get there, that if someone's being frozen out of access to a particular service, they can access it. Well, these were some pretty nasty strikes, and one of the things that happened is that the Finnish folks who were striking and who were organizing were frozen out of having meeting spaces. And so the Masaba Park Co-op I pulled out in particular because it was a place where they decided to get together and buy some land so that they could have a space, and this park is still around. There are a few other parks that are like this that popped up in Wisconsin and in Michigan and other places. This one still survives. And this was a place you could have gatherings, and you couldn't be told by the owner of the land that, no, you're not going to have your union meeting here. And I just thought of the park co-op because of the Sauna Society, that it's, in a way, it's a social and recreational aspect of what we're doing, but it's also just core to the function of how we get things done, is you have to have a gathering place. So what this would be when it wasn't an organizing center like this, was it was a place kids could go, they could learn, they would basically have classes throughout the year on a variety of topics. Just want to show you a couple quick visuals from a study of the Works Progress Administration did a study of the Finnish co-ops, in particular, in 1935, and I had shown you the national map, so I thought I'd show you again. Minnesota's the most dense shade of co-op concentration in the country, and this other map on the right is just all the different locations of where those purchasing societies are in 1935. These are two different graphs showing basically the growth of the cooperative stores in the Iron Range. The one on the left goes from 1891, when we first see the co-ops form, over to 1934 at the end of the study. And in the middle of that really extreme growth curve is the strike in 1916, 1917. So there had been strikes previous that had led to some of the growth of these stores, and people realized we need to keep the store around. We can't just only have it for the strike. And then after that, they stuck around. And the decline doesn't actually match up with this other chart, which goes from 1917 for the strike all the way to the same year. You actually see a growth sales. This is total sales on the right. So you have a declining number of stores, but more sales. And part of this is consolidation, people figuring out that you can't really operate too small of a store. Sometimes you need economy of scale. And so you have less stores, but more sales. That's a trend that happens a lot in co-ops, especially purchasing or consumer co-ops. I don't want to forget about the Swedish and Norwegian inspired co-ops. A couple notable examples, just to quickly cover, is the first cooperative store in Minnesota that we can identify was in 1868 in a little Swedish village. About 150 Swedish farmers were members of this in Vasa, Minnesota, near Red Wing. And they had a farmers co-op, a wheat marketing co-op that they had formed, but they didn't really have a way to get supplies, and they weren't on a major road, so they had to get everything by boat, and so they basically negotiated a whole year's purchases, and they kept this thing operating. This is just kind of what the skyline would look like in this little Swedish village. On the right is the Franklin Cooperative Creamery Association, founded almost entirely by Norwegians. There was one Swede in there. They noted in the initial history documents. But they formed in 1920 through a citywide labor strike here in Minneapolis. They were part of the Teamsters Union, and they were milk deliverymen. And they formed this co-op so that they could be independent from the boss shops. And so this building is on Franklin and 26th over in the Seward neighborhood. The Seward Co-op bought it not very long ago, and they created kind of a history theme in part of the building. So if you go in there, in their cafe, you can see some of the pictures and some of the quotes of the workers from this process. And that was a union co-op for its whole life and was one of the most significant co-ops nationally. So it would show up in literature throughout the country. And they sponsored programs that I will talk about a little later. All right, so when I also think about Minnesota co-ops, I think about African American communities using the cooperative model to advance their aims. In 1927, we have the formation of the Crejafon Co-op, which is a mix-up of the acronyms of the initial founders, is Crejafon. And they formed as a social club, just like the Mesaba Park Co-op, but in St. Paul, because they couldn't have dances, they couldn't have a book club, they couldn't have parties, they couldn't socialize, they couldn't create that kind of environment that they wanted because they were discriminated when they would go to a hotel to try to rent a ballroom. And so they created a social club. This particular social club, very early in its time, decided to start hosting lectures around cooperatives, and then they formed a couple of cooperatives. They formed a credit union, and they formed a grocery store, in addition to just generally supporting the notion of developing cooperatives in the African American community. But just 2 weeks ago, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, this is an article from MinPost, where Nexus Community Partners, a local nonprofit, is supporting this North Star Black Cooperative Fellowship, where they hope to create a new generation of Black co-ops in the Twin Cities. So this is very much something that is occurring today, and that the roots of when Crejafon thought, why is the co-op model important to us? Where does it come from? Really is being drawn on, those histories are being drawn on by these folks in this fellowship. If we think about US co-ops, African Americans were using the cooperative model just as long as the Europeans were. There's several books over on the table here you're welcome to look at after we're done here that talk about the Nordic countries' history of co-ops. One of them is also about the African American co-op experience. And it dates back just as long as everybody else's. A couple more examples of just credit union in South Minneapolis and a grocery store that was from the Crejafon system. There were housing co-ops, there were other forms of co-ops just in the African American community, some that sprung up because of the freeway construction. And in those cases, sometimes the co-ops that were primarily European in membership were in solidarity in helping form these co-ops to respond to the displacement. going back to that solidarity theme. The Finnish co-ops, when we move into the 1940s and 1950s, the Finnish co-ops have stopped holding their meetings in Finnish. They're not even bilingual meetings anymore. They're often English, happening in English. So maybe there's to be some material that's produced in Finnish, but really it's transitioning as more and more of the Finnish co-ops membership is becoming more diverse. And their central organizations decide to engage in several activities that are precursors of the civil rights movement in helping do economic development in impoverished communities throughout the country. And this is leading into the war on poverty initiatives that you can think about in the late 50s, early 60s. The one on the left here, the Cousin Co-op Plan, was basically a farmer-to-farmer program where farmers in the north were paired with black farmers in the south to help them understand marketing and different aspects of cooperative operation so that they could have better co-ops in the south. There were plenty of black co-ops in the south, but they didn't have the same access to markets that the northern co-ops had. So this was a specific initiative. Later on, the name of this changes a little bit, but it's still informally occurs today. There's still kind of the muscle memory of this this program is in the ag co-ops today. On the right is literally a publication from the War on Poverty organization. The Office of Economic Opportunity was created for the War on Poverty. Nearly the exact same manual that you see here was produced by the Finnish co-ops in solidarity with this African-American grocery store and other grocery stores that were open membership. And when I say open membership, I mean they were not delineated by race. So you could shop there regardless of your racial background. And the Finnish co-ops were part of this purchasing system. A lot of the products on the shelf are the co-op brand products. So they had experience working in these communities, and they had formed basically organizing manuals. Later on, the OEO takes it on, rebrands it, says this is part of the War on Poverty initiatives. It was one of several. Another thing coming out of World War II, just to mention, is our local chapter, the Japanese American Citizens League, formed a credit union because Japanese didn't have access to basic banking services. And the credit unions associated with GACL pop up all around the country. I just included a couple clippings from this chapter here and a picture of one of their board pictures. But this is a common theme. There was a lot of solidarity actually with the Japanese community here in Minnesota, particularly around housing. Also the food co-ops nationally were very quick to hire and include Japanese Americans after internment was brought to an end. And this year marks the 75th anniversary of internment, so I felt it was appropriate to bring this up. Not only as kind of an inclusion and belonging, but bringing together and kind of mending, because it was a very difficult time to have these Americans brought off and interred when they were actually working in co-ops, especially in California. And there was efforts throughout their internment in which co-ops made sure to be able to deliver to the internment camps and conduct trade with the camps, which is a whole nother presentation. Mexicans migrating up to Minnesota were working in co-ops, especially sugar beet co-ops, for quite a long time, but I'm pulling out here some instances where they formed their own co-ops. The first one I could find is Our Lady of Guadalupe Credit Union, and that's a parish in St. Paul that formed its credit union in 1948. So you can see kind of the ledger and their bylaws. But we have some that are around today. Bloomington and Lake Street is Mercado Central. This co-op is owned by the business owners. So there's about 40 business owners. Those are the members. Not every single worker, not every single shopper, just if you own a business there, you are a member of the co-op that is the market as a whole. Agua Gorda Co-op, this is from the Star Tribune about 2 years ago. They're a farmer co-op that's up in Long Prairie, Minnesota, and they're aspiring to start their own farms. And the Latino Economic Development Center that's here in Minneapolis, they also have office in St. Paul, they help get this group going, and they've been talking with farmers about selling their businesses to Mexican folks who might be interested in buying, let's say, a dairy or a grain farm or so on. Hmong immigrants also have been adopting the cooperative model since 1979. We have Hmong refugees coming in around 1975. This picture on the left is the Lao Family Community Center in St. Paul. In 1979 is the first record I can find of forming needlework co-ops, craft co-ops for marketing their crafts. Today we have the Hmong American Farmers Association. They have a CSA where you can buy from a co-op of Hmong farmers. I could tell several more stories that are specific to these different ethnic communities. The city of Minneapolis has created a program called the Co-op Technical Assistance Program, where they commissioned some research on local co-ops just in Minneapolis, and also created a curriculum to help groups from all these different backgrounds form co-ops. Because if you try to go find someone to help you form one of these, it's kind of difficult. If you go to a small business administration lender, they'll say, that doesn't seem to qualify. Is that a business? Is that a nonprofit? What is that? So it's confusing, and so the city decided, we'll create a very modest program and just very carefully assess how we want to get into this. The first step was creating this research report. There's a full report on the city's website that gets into all the details of 20 different co-ops that were in formation when they commissioned the report. The Sauna Society went through the classes that were the first run of the cohort of the CTAP program. Just one note, because we're here, the American Swedish Institute, across the street is a housing co-op that the Swan Turnblad, who commissioned the construction of the mansion, lived over in an apartment on the 5th floor of this building before it was a co-op. And some of the investors at the time, after Swan had passed away, and they decided, we want to sell it to the residents, and the residents formed a committee to buy it. So it's still a co-op today. So in the mid-1940s, that became a co-op. And one of the sellers was the chair of the American Swedish Institute at the time. So it was seen to be this good idea. There was one person who tried to stop it. One of the residents didn't want to be part of the group, and so they had a whole legal case, stopped it for 1 year, and they ended up buying it the next year. I also want to mention that the newspaper that the founder here essentially was editor of, or publisher of, would often have stories about co-ops in Sweden and what was going on in Sweden with the mining co-ops and farming co-ops and so on. And there would also be columns that would cover the cooperative activities here in the US, covered in detail the activities of the agriculture department in the US and how that might affect Swedish farmers here. So I found several hits by just typing the Swedish word for cooperative into a couple search engines for the newspaper that the Minnesota Historical Society has. All right, so that's it for me. This is the Minnesota Cooperative Education Foundation. They have scholarships for high school students, also for undergrad and grad students. So if you know somebody who's potentially interested in a career that would go down the path of cooperatives, apply for that. This will be available immediately afterwards on Twitter, so I'll send that out, and that'll be at least one place it's at. And again, there's books up here to check out. I'm going to hand it over to JP, who is going to tell us a little more about 612 Sauna Society. So thank you all.